This is How to Reach the West Again, a podcast that explores what it will take to have a fresh missionary encounter with Western culture. I'm your host, Brandon O'Brien. Our time together each week begins with an explanation from Tim Keller about one of 6 essential elements of a missionary encounter. After that, we'll have conversations with scholars and practitioners of various sorts who study these things and do them in diverse contexts throughout Europe and North America. Think of Dr. Keller's presentation as a pass over difficult terrain from a relatively high altitude, and each of our guests as guides at regional airports who can show us what the features we saw from the air look like on the ground. This week, we're getting the lay of the land. Tim Keller defines what he means by missionary encounter and identifies the biggest obstacles we face in our pursuit of it in this cultural moment. Next, we hear from Dr. Stefan Pas, a missiologist in Amsterdam, who proposes a missional spirituality that can sustain a missionary encounter. And last but not least, Iotis Kantartsis from Athens reminds us of the importance of paying close attention to our context, to the ways our generalizations about Western culture play out in our own cities and neighborhoods. This is great stuff. Without further ado, Tim Keller.
How to Reach the West Again. For 30 years, we've been told that Western society is becoming post-Christian, and that the church must adapt to a changing culture in order to remain relevant. Despite this gloomy prediction, Christianity has displayed remarkable staying power. There are parts of North America where substantial numbers of people still hold traditional religious and moral beliefs. While mainline churches have declined, evangelical churches largely have not. It might be more accurate, though, to say that instead of being thoroughly post-Christian, America today is marked by spotty Christendom in many places. But the overall decline of Christian influence in the West is inarguable. Every generation is becoming less religious and less Christian. More than 2/3 of the churches in the United States have plateaued or are in decline. While religion was broadly seen as a social good, or at least benign, increasing numbers of people now see the church as bad for people and a major obstacle to social progress. Traditional Christian beliefs about sexuality and gender are being viewed as dangerous and restrictive of people's basic civil rights. Instead of wringing our hands over the loss of cultural influence in Western culture, this decline should prompt us to examine ourselves, pray, and work toward a new missionary engagement with Western culture. We have to model and proclaim the Christian faith in our generation in a way that is both intelligible and compelling to our neighbors. The main challenges to having this sort of encounter have been the same over the centuries. One is spiritual pride. Jonathan Edwards reflected on how revivals were often undermined by human pride, which can manifest itself in unnecessary disunity, fractiousness, and tribalism among Christians. Another abiding challenge is syncretism, when believers mix their faith with the idols of the culture, as in the book of Judges. For example, Judges 2, verses 11 to 15. While we may not be tempted toward literal polytheism, Christians in the West today certainly have to resist the lure of cultural idols, especially those that promise political power or social relevance. Along with commonalities, each age has its own unique challenges. Today, churches in Western society have to deal with something they have never faced before, a culture increasingly hostile to their faith that is not merely non-Christian, such as in China, India, and Middle Eastern countries, but post-Christian. What are the biggest obstacles we are facing in our cultural moment? For centuries, Christians have been able to assume that everyone around them believed in a sacred order, a transcendent supernatural dimension of reality that was the ground of all moral absolutes and that promised life after death. All cultures believed in a standard of right and wrong to which human beings were obligated to conform regardless of their feelings. They therefore also believed in objective guilt and sin, and that the problems of human life are solved when we connect to that sacred order rather than simply living for ourselves. Of course, Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists, and animists disagreed, even violently, over what that sacred order was, and they rejected the Christian account of it. But everyone agreed that it existed and that we needed to find a way to touch it. Late modern culture is the first culture based on a rejection of a sacred order. In the name of individual freedom, today's society declares that there are no transcendent realities to which we must conform. Rather, we choose our own values and we create our own meaning in life. Academic, artistic, and entertainment institutions teach that the only sacred depths are the ones found within us. Indeed, if there's a moral absolute in today's culture, it is that we must not say that there are moral absolutes, let alone a sacred order with which all people must align. Such statements are said to oppress people and limit their freedom. Past evangelistic strategies assumed that nearly everyone held this shared set of beliefs about a sacred order, that there was a God, an afterlife, a standard of moral truth, and a sense of sin. We might call these the religious dots that evangelists could assume in their hearers. Evangelism, then, was simply connecting the dots that listeners already possessed in order to prove the truth of the gospel. Today's culture believes that the thing we need salvation from is the idea that we need salvation. How, then, do you evangelize people who lack any sense of sin or transcendence, or who lack the traditional basic religious infrastructure, such as belief in a supreme being or the afterlife? The church in the West has not faced this situation before. In the United States, the average person now spends 2.5 hours a day on social media. In 2015, the average 12th grader was online for 4 hours a day. Younger people spend much more time and are more profoundly shaped by the internet. In Reclaiming Conversation, Sherry Turkle of MIT says that increased time on social media correlates with a measurable loss of empathy, the ability to put ourselves in someone else's shoes. More and more, what is outside seems less real than what is inside one's head and feelings. That means technology conveys the narratives and beliefs of secular modernity regarding identity, freedom, happiness, and relativism in an immersive way far beyond what TV, radio, or movies could ever do. And technology doesn't merely give us different beliefs, it also changes the very way we form them. Beliefs become very thin, chosen only if they fit how we want to see ourselves, and easily discarded when they do not. The challenges of formation in such a digital culture are considerable. Our traditional models of biblical and spiritual formation, through just a few hours of public worship time in a community group, are insufficient for countering the impact of 24/7 digital technology throughout the week. Our models of theological formation give us a firm grasp of biblical doctrine, which is indispensable, but they fail to deconstruct the culture's beliefs and provide better Christian answers to the questions of the late modern human heart. Across the West and elsewhere, we are experiencing increasing amounts of political polarization. There is enormous dissatisfaction with the political establishment, and people are willing to vote for candidates, both right and left, who would have been considered extreme just 10 years ago. This is one of the bitter fruits of the secular project, the first effort in history to build cohesive societies without a common set of shared moral and religious values. James Eglinton describes the two poles of our fragmented culture in an article for Christianity Today entitled Populism versus Progressivism. Who knows best? He identifies, quote, the emergence of two rival visions of the world. One attracts those receptive to the restoration of national greatness, the importance of groups over individuals, and the conservation of the past. The other pulls on those receptive to a starkly individualistic future, unhitched from the obligations of the past and bound instead to the notion of progress. Crucially, each of these cultural forces also repels those who prove unreceptive to it. For this reason, our cultural commentators now talk of two Americas, two Brazils, and two United Kingdoms. In each of these settings, populations migrate toward opposite polar extremities. One of these views makes an idol out of individual freedom, the other out of race and nation, blood and soil. Both are secular. The transcendent God is missing, and something created and earthly is deified. The great danger is churches getting caught up in this polarization and becoming mere tools of either a leftward or a rightward political coalition. In America, for example, the country is now seeing the development of both blue evangelicalism and red evangelicalism. The former talks about racial and economic justice, but is quieter about the biblical teaching on subjects such as sexuality, gender, and family. The latter condemns sexual immorality and secularism, but grows silent when its political allies fan the flames of racial resentment toward immigrants and minority communities. When the church, in the interest of acquiring political power, aligns too much with the current age's secular left or right, it is sapped of both spiritual power and credibility with non-Christians. We see the political captivity of the faithful. The solution cannot be some imaginary apolitical withdrawal, as if that were possible. Christians must learn to do something new, to engage politically yet critically, not capitulating to any reigning ideology, in order to be truly salt and light in society, rather than part of its decay. These three challenges must be tackled directly and deliberately. Christian leaders must dedicate time and talent to developing strategies that will overcome these barriers to a gospel movement in our generation. We are entering a new era in which, in many places in the West, there is not only no social benefit to being a Christian, but an actual social cost to espousing faith. Culture is becoming more actively hostile toward Christian beliefs and practices. Semi-biblical, generically religious beliefs in God, truth, sin, and the afterlife, those things we've called the religious dots, they are disappearing in more and more people, as culture produces people for whom Christianity is not only offensive, but incomprehensible. Therefore, we must find ways of evangelizing people who lack the religious dots and would never think of coming to church. And we must find ways of churching and forming people as Christians in the midst of a very different culture. To clarify, a missionary encounter is not a withdrawal from culture into communities with little connection to the rest of society, nor is it an effort to secure political power in order to impose Christian standards and beliefs on an unwilling populace, nor is it an effort to become so quote-unquote relevant that the church becomes completely adapted to and assimilated into the culture. Instead, a missionary encounter connects, unlike the strategies of withdrawal, yet confronts, unlike the strategies of assimilation, and therefore actually converts people, unlike all the strategies, including those of political domination. And while critiquing all the other strategies at a fundamental level, a church that is embarked on a missionary encounter does maintain its distinctiveness, a goal shared with the withdrawal approach. It does often affirm and always serve its neighbors, a goal shared with the assimilation approach. And it does call people to repent and change, a goal occasionally shared with a politically assertive approach. In many ways, we must look to the early church that had an effective missionary encounter with a very hostile culture. And yet, since our Western culture is post-Christian and the challenges it poses are unique, our generation's missionary encounter will not look exactly like any missionary encounter that the church has ever had in the past.
Most people who have only a tourist's knowledge of the Netherlands think that it's completely secular and all that. But there's actually a quite strong Bible Belt area in the Netherlands, running from the northeast to the southwest. And you find quite a lot of towns and villages there where the majority of the population is still not just a church member, but large minorities or even majorities are still church-going. They're Protestant and conservative Reformed usually, with a lot of free church, evangelical types of churches orbiting around it. Yeah, I came from one of these places, and I went to Amsterdam in 2005 together with my family.
This is Dr. Stefan Paas, who holds the J.H. Bavink Chair for Missiology and Intercultural Theology at Free University of Amsterdam. He has written extensively on mission and evangelism in Europe, and his newest book, Pilgrims and Priests, is a gem. In the first half or so of the book, he describes the diversity of Christian postures toward cultural engagement. In the second half, he proposes an alternative, what he calls a missional spirituality, which draws heavily on the exilic literature of the Old Testament and on 1 Peter from the New. I asked Stefan to describe the experience of moving from the Bible Belt to one of Europe's most secular cities.
Yeah, so one of the most important differences is a social one. I mean, mentally or rationally, you know, of course, that there are non-Christians, and in the place where I lived, it was not. I mean, it was not that there were no non-Christians. Our neighbours were non-Christians. Good friends of ours were not church-going, but still, and in this Bible Belt society, it was a normal thing to be a Christian, and that is something. What I learned, I think, when I moved to Amsterdam, that I am a social being as well. I'm not just a rational being. I can deal with all sorts of arguments, but when you live somewhere, when virtually no one is interested in what you believe, does not even take the effort to refute it or to criticize it, that does something with you. It shows that I think all our arguments, all our thinking are also embedded in who we are, who we belong to. Living in a deeply secularized culture also helps you to refocus on what's really important in your faith. For example, back there, most of my friends were members of the same church. And just to give you a picture, I was a member of a Christian Reformed church there. And there was one other Christian Reformed church in the same place, both very big churches, more than 1,000 members, both of them. Once per year, they had what the Dutch call a pulpit change. That the pastor of one church could preach in the other church and vice versa. The reason that they didn't do that more was because of subtle differences in theology and culture and all that. Anyway, members of the same church. In Amsterdam, of course, that's not an issue at all. That's luxury. I mean, that's all Bible Belt stuff. So here, you're already very happy if you meet a Christian, whether he's Roman Catholic or Pentecostal or whatever. Someone who believes in Jesus is already a big blessing.
I'm curious how you would maybe summarize or diagnose the spiritual climate of maybe the West, secular West generally, but I'm curious also in your more specific context of Northwest Europe.
Well, all throat scraping aside, I would say it's a Christian culture or a post-Christian culture in the sense of Christians, confessing Christians and church-going Christians meet in their Western culture a lot of intuitions and practices that have at some point broken off from Christianity and have radicalized, but are still recognizably Christian in some way. For example, take the response of the Dutch government against the COVID pandemic. What we saw was a great shared concern about the weak and those who were very vulnerable to the disease. So all the free people and the strong people were restricted in their freedom, basically because of the people who could not really take care of themselves. That's not a pagan impulse. That's not what the Romans did. That's something that we learned on the way in the past 2 millennia, something like that. Probably because of centuries of preaching and of gospel sharing. So there is a sociological story, of course, of decline, to an extent at least. Because what is this decline? I mean, decline in numbers at least. We should take that seriously. Mm-hmm. But I'm not buying into the story that our culture now is darker than it used to be or something like that. Partly because I believe, and that is a perspective that is relatively underexplored in missiology, namely that the secular culture is also a post-Christian culture. It's produced to some extent by Christianity. Our late modern secular culture couldn't have been there without Christianity. And like I said, I learned that from for example, Charles Taylor, who says in his essay on Catholic modernity, he says that we're dealing in our late modern culture, we're dealing with intuitions and practices that have broken off from Christianity and radicalized because they've come outside of Christianity. So they've radicalized, which is not always a good thing, but still, they're still recognizably Christian. So that is what I think renders the missionary task in the West so complex. We're not just dealing with a pre-Christian culture or a pagan culture, and not just a rebellious culture, a prodigal culture. There is really a new thing there. We're still trying to feel our way around it. And often it's a bit embarrassing to see that in this culture some aspects of the gospel seem to have been understood better than by many people inside the church.
The new challenge of mission in post-Christian cultures requires a new approach to cultural engagement. Stephan makes an interesting and probably controversial claim in his book Pilgrims and Priests, that despite all their differences in theological nuance, most Protestant approaches to cultural engagement ultimately share one fundamental assumption.
So one of the big questions in mission in the West, but wherever, is of course, what's the purpose of it? I mean, what in the end do we want to achieve when is mission completed, and all that kind of questions. My general idea is that often implicit in all sorts of missionary ideas and missionary ecclesiology is the idea of Christendom, that mission somehow in some way tries to achieve a Christian society, either by individual conversions and just adding them up until everyone is converted, church growth, or by transformation ideals or Christian culture ideals and all that. I sometimes push my friends who are in that direction, say, well, but when will this be finished, this transformation? What do we want to achieve? And then in some way or another, Christendom pops up.
In place of transformation, Stefan prefers different language to describe the goal of a missionary encounter.
Whenever something transforms, it can always fall back. That's why I like to use the language of signs. So what we're doing in mission is build signs for the kingdom. And sometimes signs are temporary. Sometimes they're not very impressive. Like a sandcastle on a beach. It's beautiful and you have a lot of fun when you're doing it. And in one way or another, it's also may present some comfort and blessing and something genuine. But it's not always there to last. In a mission, especially in the secular West, you'll meet a lot of those kind of missionary initiatives. They have some results, if I can use the word. Some things are really happening. I mean, it's not without results. But often these results are very precarious, temporary, disappointing sometimes. At least disappointing from the perspective of ground culture change and all that.
A question most of us in ministry are inclined to ask is, will it work? But instead of the language of transformation, Stefan prefers the language of signs, and in place of outcomes or impact, he prefers to talk about the inherent good of the work itself, regardless of the return on investment. This brings him to worship.
For me, that's about doxology, glorifying God. That's a very reformed motive, which has for me always been very helpful and very liberating. If Christians worship God, if they doxologize, so to speak, what they say is basically nothing more or less than this. There is one who is just good. He's not good for anything. He's just good, period. And so I think that's the same is true for everything that belongs to God or that sort of reflects his being, everything that witnesses about him. There's goodness in it without being subjected to all sorts of purposes that we have thought of, like conquering, building up institutions or all that. So the language of mission is very important there. I mean, when I was writing this particular chapter and thinking about the spirituality of all this, two Bible texts were very important to me. The one is in Luke chapter 15. There's joy in heaven about one sinner who converts. And then the other one is Galatians, I think chapter 6 or 5, never grow weary in doing good. Now I was saying, whatever, if you're evangelizing or doing food banks or working for justice, I can guarantee you one thing: if you evangelize and have church growth ideas in the back of your mind in the West, you can't be happy about one. I mean, heaven resounds with joy about that, but you can't. And the same is true for food banks and justice. You will grow weary very, very soon if you want to transform the world by it.
Stefan's move to Amsterdam prompted something like a crisis of faith, but it also sparked the beginning of a deeper awareness of who God is and the beginning of a spirituality of exile.
When I went to Amsterdam, I felt abandoned spiritually. I couldn't find God anymore until I realized that God, for me, had been part of a culture. He was really there, but to an extent, God was so interwoven with the whole social dynamic of the Bible Belt place and institutions. And when I was uprooted and the institutional presence of Christianity was very weak, it was difficult for me to find God. So what I learned in the city, and I think that was a deep spiritual awareness, partly by praying, partly by studying, especially the book of Daniel, was that. And I think I even listened to one of Tim's sermons about Daniel, where he said the exile, the people who carried off into exile, was something that God had done. It was not just Nebuchadnezzar or the Babylonians. what I learned from the Bible, the books of exile, second Isaiah, for example, it's not just that there is still a presence of God in exile. No, it's even more. Israel discovers that God is much greater than they had ever thought. If God is the God of your fathers and of the institutions, to an extent that can produce very strong religion and very strong identities, to an extent, it's true. And I'm not saying that is wrong in itself. But your God is often not bigger, not greater than that particular environment. So outside it's just darkness, or enemy culture, or the persecutors, or whatever. Those people who want gay marriage and all that. And then when you start living in exile, you lose a lot of those certainties, perhaps. But what you learn is that God is much greater than you thought. He is the God of the ends of the earth. Really, you can know that mentally, but to really discover it and really spiritually experience it, it might be that you first must be brought in a situation of weakness and foolishness, like the Apostle Paul.
It's a fundamentally different thing to know from Jerusalem that God is God in Babylon as well, but it's very different to find him in Babylon,
Isn't
right?
it? Yeah.
And to feel him at work there, right? It struck me as I was reading through, you make the claim that our contemporary situation is probably more similar to the situation that makes up a lot of the biblical context of exile and occupation and diaspora. Our situation is more similar to that than it is to our parents, grandparents' situation of Christendom.
Yeah, that's what I think. I was set on this track by two very conservative Reformed pastors in the Netherlands who wrote, each separately, wrote a book on judgment. They say secularization is a judgment of God. Modern Christians, they claimed, see secularization as a sort of problem to be solved, but it's a crisis in the original sense of the word, a judgment. So we need to pray, to repent, and all that. Now I thought, this rings a bell. I'm an Old Testament scholar. So I was thinking, this sounds very much like Jeremiah or the Book of Kings. So the reflections on the exile. Yes, God has punished us for our sins in the past, which is, I think, a good biblical sense-making narrative. I mean, there's truth in that. And I think the Western Church has a lot to repent for, looking back. I was also thinking about the exilic traditions. There's more to it. And it was not just a biblical theological observation, it was also something pastorally. I mean, when I did lectures or speaking or preaching in several churches in the country, what I found was, when I got questions afterward, let's say from older people who had seen their children leave the church and were very, very sad about that, I thought, I don't really help these people if I tell them that God is punishing them. It's important to tell that, for example, to self-confident establishment or perhaps church leaders or whatever who are in denial. But these poor people, they need comfort, they need hope, they don't need an extra slap in the face. I was thinking of, so from these both perspectives, I started to look again at these traditions, and like you said already, what you find in the Bible is not just, that's a strong tradition, certainly, the reflections on, well, we have sinned, or our ancestors have sinned and we are punished now, but also people who really do not know what they have done wrong. Take Psalm 74, for example, and there are other Psalms as well, where they say, God, you have abandoned us. What have we done? We've always served you, and now this. Think of Lamentations, which is even rebellious in a sense. Lamentations chapter 2 or 3, which make this parody of Psalm 23. You're not a good shepherd, Lord. When will you do something? Angry voices or very hurt voices are also heard. And then there is, of course, like I said, the second Isaiah, with the great perspectives, an exilic prophet who says, but in exile we rediscover who God really is. He is not just the God of our fathers, he's the God of the world, he's the God of Babylon. All these things together, the rediscovery of who God is, the new horizons of faith, I think are, for me, ingredients of the exilic experience. And today you see exactly the same among Christians, I think. In my book, Pilgrims and Priests, the 4th chapter, when I talk about exile, actually my question was, in the back of my mind, what has God to do with all this? I mean, how is God active in secularization of our culture? Mm-hmm. Which is a daring question to an extent, because most Christians would immediately say, well, of course, he has nothing to do with that. He's against it. But if that is true, if God is not active somehow, not present somehow in the secularization of our culture, then I think we're really in dire straits, because then it would mean that God has left us, He's abandoned us.
It's interesting to use the language of exile because we have not been geographically removed from the places that we grew up. As I was reading that section, I kept thinking of Gregor Samsa in the Metamorphosis, Kafka's story, where he goes to sleep one day at home and he wakes up and he's been transformed into something vile, And I think that's the experience, I think, that a lot of, whether it's fearful or nostalgic evangelicals feel, is that we woke up as strangers and vermin in our own homes, and how do we what do we do now, right? And so I wonder if those callings of pilgrim and priest can give us a way to engage that proactively.
In the Bible, when you are a stranger, like Joseph or Daniel or Queen Esther, it's not necessarily that you're discriminated against or persecuted all the time. You can become a minister or a queen or a viceroy. You can have quite a good career, but it's very vulnerable. It's very fragile. They can take it away from you anytime. So you're depending on the goodwill of others. You no longer run the show as Christians. And I'm saying that's not necessarily a bad thing. So what does it mean to have a faithful missionary presence as a minority? And that's where the priest metaphor comes in. I'm building here on the first letter of Peter in the New Testament, where he says to his churches that you are strangers and you are a priesthood. And I think the priesthood is an excellent metaphor to explore when you think about a minority mission. Priests are a minority by definition. They're called out of the people or out of the world to represent the people for God, represent God before the people. So there's a sort of mediating function there. What I said, if you look in the Old Testament, what do priests do when they represent the people before God? They worship, very important task. So bring all of life before God. The sad things, the good things, the anger, the joy, all that. And doing it out of your relationships with the neighborhood and with your friends and your colleagues. Listen to them, listen to their stories, and just ask them, can I pray for you? Can I thank for you? And do you mind if I would pray for you in church? And if we would pray together for you in church, you could join us and tell your story yourself. If you don't, we'll do it for you. And of course, what priests also do is not just worshipping, but they also come to God to sacrifice. So if you translate it for today, I would say to bring the best of your culture before God. And then the other way around, representing God before the people, well, it's teaching. The priests teach the Torah in the Old Testament, and they bless. There's wonderful things to explore what it means in the practice of mission, to teach people, to bless people. It helps me, when I think about this mediating function of the priesthood, I'm thinking of those things, this whole network of activities that are representative somehow, and are and connecting people to God and God to people through those groups of Christians that are called to be priests. To me, that's a hopeful and also identity-giving metaphor as a Christian. What I can say when I, for example, teach people or do lectures in churches, where you often meet people are the only Christian in their family or in the street. Well, when I share church growth ideals or transforming society ideals, these people are just looking at me and that you don't understand one word of where I am at, my situation.
Yeah.
But when they are a bit hopeless or a bit lost courage or whatever you call it, when I say, well, you're not just a single person who happens to be a Christian. You're not just the one fool in the family. You're a priest, and you're a priest for them as well.
You've already given some hopeful perspective, but I wonder if you have a final word of encouragement to speak to that anxiety that many feel.
When they look at statistics or think, well, if we all share forces, if we join, then we can do great things and all that. I'm not optimistic in that sense. Not pessimistic either, but we'll just see. But I'm hopeful. Leslie Newbigin once in his old age was asked, do you have any optimistic ideas about the future of the West? And he says, well, I'm hopeful, Christ has risen. Can sound like a cliche, but in the end, that's the only answer I can give as a Christian. I'm very hopeful, extremely hopeful actually, because Christ has risen. What I can do here and now is doing my work as a priest. and being hopeful that God will bless it and will use it and will give some eternity to it.
The metaphors of pilgrims and priests are rich for shaping how we imagine a missionary encounter with Western culture. But none of us interacts with Western culture in the abstract. We all live somewhere in time and space, and that somewhere has a particular history and particular sensibilities and particular challenges and opportunities. I spoke with Iotis Kontartsis, pastor of the First Greek Evangelical Church, a historic Presbyterian church in the center of Athens, about the unique cultural context of his city and the importance of speaking the various cultural languages of your neighbors.
You know, when I first started reading Tim Keller's articles way back, I was really fascinated by this whole idea of contextualization. Now, the temptation is always to copy, okay? So here I am in the center of Athens trying to mimic Tim Keller in a way, talking about postmodernism and about secularism and all of that. And then, you know, there is this moment of epiphany, another fancy Greek word, that you say, what am I doing now? I mean, what is the principle behind it? That you need to study your context and try to really see the particular challenges of your context and then try to address it. And I think that is what, you know, what is the temptation there, that we all want the recipe. And okay, that worked, and I'll take the recipe and I'll just do it. But the recipe is to make up your own recipe, and that is very difficult.
Right. You pastor in Athens. Tell us about the kind of a quick overview of the context that you minister in Athens.
Greece is a Greek Orthodox country in the southeast part of Europe. So let me just say a few things about Europe, because when we say Europe, I mean, people think that it's like a big country. It is, and it is not. So you can cut it vertically and horizontally, and so you have northern and southern Europe. So there are economic and other factors that differentiate the two. And then you have the western and the eastern, if you take the vertical line. So we are like southeast. What does it mean to be in the southeast of Europe? It means that we are in between. We are a country in transitions, as several countries in that area. There is an emblem in a flag that used to be in Byzantium, and you have a two-headed eagle. You know, it's an eagle with two heads. And interestingly enough, in some ways that epitomizes what is Greece. It's a country and it's a culture that looks both ways. So you look east and west at the same time. Now, let me talk a little bit about the religious landscape. As I said, it's Greek Orthodox. Evangelical Protestants in Greece and in most countries in the Southern Balkans are not more than 0.2, 0.3%. The only exception in the Balkans would be Bulgaria, which has a larger percentage. Again, is 2%, not something really, great. So you have this aspect then in our context, which is being a minority. So it's interesting to think about, okay, what does it mean to be a religious minority in Greece? The best way to understand who are we in the eyes of a typical Greek Orthodox person is, okay, think in your context, a religious group which is 0.3%. Typically these are really weird people. If your kids join them, you will be really worried. Okay, who are these people? I want to take them out, and So we have a young student who started coming to our church, and interestingly enough, for the first couple of months, her mother was coming with her. She's a good mother. Because I mean, I don't blame here because, okay, who are these people? Okay, so this is who are we. So and part of this suspicion is that this is an imported cult, that this is an American cult, and and I think that in our context, and that is true not only in the East, but I would say also in Italy, Spain, Portugal, history and tradition is very important in our places. In the United States, it doesn't matter so much because you don't have that, but, like from my office, I can see the Parthenon actually. So history, I mean, history in our context, in Greece at least, is a very powerful argument. So it is not a rational argument, but if you say, let's go back and see that, history plays a very significant role. So proving that you are part of the Catholic Church, I think that is a very important thing, a strategy.
What was right there in Athens in Acts 17 that Paul had to prove that he was not introducing a foreign god to Athenian culture, right? That
Yes.
So there's maybe a very long history of suspicion of imported religion in your part of the world.
You are right. I many times think that we need to have the copyright of that passage being underneath the Mars Hill. But anyway, you are allowed to use it,
In Athens, a city Iotis calls the East of the West, history and pedigree are important apologetic tools, which is less the case in places like the United States. But there's another important contextual issue in Athens. The culture is not post-Christian generically, it's specifically and increasingly post-Orthodox. That means a person's relationship to religion takes on very different contours here.
Religion in Greece is not simply like a personal choice or something that you do in order to fulfill your spiritual quest. Religion is part of your national heritage and identity. It's something that you are born into. Being Greek Orthodox means that if you are Greek and you are born in a Greek family and you are baptized in the church, you are already Greek Orthodox. Being Orthodox may not mean anything at all spiritually, but still is part of their identity. And there is this interesting dynamic there, which I think is very important for us to keep in mind, and that is a more general observation, if I may, about secularization, because many times even with Europe, we say, okay, Europe is secularized, which means, okay, religion doesn't matter. We need to be more careful about that, because you may have totally secular people in life, but that does not mean necessarily that religion doesn't matter at all, or faith. Grace Davy, who is a British sociologist, she brings this idea about vicarious religiosity, which means in our context in Greece, okay, I don't go to church, I don't care about religion, but it is important for me that there is a church operating, that there are monks in the monasteries praying and all of that. So I think that makes, again, it's a matter of complexity that we always need to be aware of, even when we talk about secularization.
If someone's identity is connected with a sort of latent religiosity and with ethnic identity and with a national identity, etc., if there are kind of rituals and rhythms that are native to them, how do you go from there in your context to the gospel of Jesus? How do you walk people to Jesus from where they are in your context in Athens?
That's a great question, and I would say that there's not one answer. I have mentioned Grace Davy, and another thing that she was a proponent, and I think she originated the idea that she argues that in the West, the secular West, you have the phenomenon of believing without belonging. So you have people who distrust, religion and the church and whatnot, but that does not mean institutional religion, but not necessarily spiritual matters, and they believe. So believing without belonging. Now, using this idea, I think it's a useful tool to think through that. So what I would call the cultural Christianity or the nominal Christianity, at least, in our case, the national identity Christianity, you have a lot of people who belong without believing. They may, if you ask them, what you are, they may say, I'm Greek Orthodox or whatnot. So they belong, but they don't necessarily believe in whatever way we may describe believing. Now, I think this is not, definitely we're not satisfied with that, so we don't want to let them there. Now, I think that perhaps there may be a variation of that. And so we say, okay, let's talk about belonging before believing, or belonging as a step to believing. Now, as Protestants, we have, and I think this is a heritage of the several awakenings and this, George Whitefield, and that evangelism is, authentic evangelism happens outside the church. We inherited this idea that evangelism is something that needs to happen out there, like in the streets, outside, and then you believe out there, and after you believe, then you join a church. There is definitely believing before belonging. So that's a clear-cut distinction. I would say that I would be more open, let's say, to the idea, okay, let people belong before believing. Let people belong, let people come, let people even participate in the gestures without necessarily, we had this very difficult decision, I remember several years ago, as a board of elders, whether we should allow this gentleman to take part into the communion, a guy who is a self-proclaimed atheist, but he comes every Sunday at church, and he sings the songs, he listens to the sermon, he even cries sometimes during the sermon, and he wants to take part of the communion after you explain what this thing is. So we had this difficult decision. What do we do? In a way, you may say, okay, let's do some shock treatment and say, you know what, you are close but not in. That's why you need to think about that. You need to make a decision. Okay, so that is one way, and it may be true. The other is let him do it. Let him belong, and let's see how that works in his life, how the Holy Spirit will work.
You're probably wondering what Yotis and his leadership team decided to do in this case. Well, he didn't tell me. But he did tell me about another sort of language he thinks the church should become fluent in to be successful in a missionary encounter in Athens.
We need to rediscover the language of gestures in our Protestant tradition, because we tend to be very cerebral. So let me again give a practical example. One of the good things about COVID, we're not allowed to sing, so we don't sing. We have someone who sings a song, like a soul or something, but that's it. So we rediscovered the sacramental aspect of worship, because in most evangelical churches, what used to be, like if you read the historic liturgies by Luther, by Calvin, there's the liturgy of the word, and then there is the liturgy of the sacrament or of the table, these two main things. So now we cannot sing. What do? We cannot simply stand up and, read the scriptures and preach. This is, so we said, let's do the Lord's Supper every Sunday. Now we do it every Sunday. The way we were doing the Lord's Supper, it was like an addendum at the end. Mm-hmm. After you had a full service, like people were tired. Okay, now let's do the supper as well. Now, it's like half an hour. It's literally following the tradition of our forefathers, the liturgy of the word, and then there is the liturgy of the table. This is another language that we also need to learn in order to engage people. Another aspect, if I may add, when we talk about, rituals and gestures, is again that we need to avoid the Platonic temptation to undermine the body. Okay, so we are embodied beings. So the body matters, and it should matter in our worship. At least for us, having a conversation, it's very interesting, discussing with a very good friend of mine who's a Greek Orthodox, very open-minded. Many times I heard him complain about his church that is lacking catechesis, so which is content, which we do very well. But I remember once he said, what I'm missing when I come to your services, this embodied presence. That the body in a way participates in the whole worship experience. And I think I'm not saying that this is the answer to all the problems, obviously, but I'm saying that this is something that we need to, as I said, is a language that we need to learn.
The idea of believing before belonging comes up in other conversations in this series, so stay tuned for more on that. But right now, it draws together some themes in this episode. For one, how do we share the gospel with people for whom, as Tim Keller put it, Christianity is not only offensive, but incomprehensible? What is one of the signs of the kingdom, to use Stephan Passa's phrase, that points non-Christian people toward Jesus? Hiotis suggests that one of our most powerful signs is a compelling community that people want to belong to.
I was really struck when I realized, as I was reading works of ecclesiastical writers, fathers, church fathers of the first centuries, interestingly enough, the main thrust of their apology had to do with the way of life of Christians. What in their apologetic work, they're not defending ideas, but they're explaining why we do this. That's why I think I'm really convinced that church planting is very important as a tool, because people need to have the opportunity and belonging. Before people need to join a community where they can see a different lifestyle, which will, be, so to say, a good apology of the gospel, and then lead them to decisions or change of life and whatnot. And even theologically, if you think about that, I always think about this scripture passage in 2 Corinthians where it says that if someone is in Christ, he's a new creation. The old has gone, and we may talk about that, we may proclaim it, but at the end of the day, someone may ask, okay, what should I believe about a new creation? What should I believe about the restoration of all in Jesus Christ? What should I believe? I think that the most profound argument would be, come with me at church to see this new creation pattern in our lives. This is what new creation in a miniature means. So this is, even theologically speaking, it's a powerful argument. So these are things that I think we need to take into consideration when we think about our approach to evangelism in the eastern part of the West.
That's all for today, but there's so much more to come. Next week, we're back to talk about a Christian high theory that critiques Western culture's dominant narratives. And we talk about how to do that, even while the broader culture is offering critiques of the church's own errors and blind spots. So subscribe today to make sure you don't miss anything. And I know you'll want to hear more from our excellent guests. You can find print versions of our full interviews at redeemercitytocity.com/resources, along with links to books and other resources mentioned in this episode. How to Reach the West Again is a production of Redeemer City to City. It is written and hosted by Brandon O'Brien. Just about everything else is done by City to City's resident Swiss Army knife, Braden Gregg. Special thanks to Roosevelt Community Church in Phoenix, Arizona, for the generous use of their studio space. To learn more about Redeemer City to City, visit us online at redeemercitytocity.com.